So, good afternoon, everyone. Hello from Berlin. My name is Pauline Turkman, and I am a research associate for the European Foreign Affairs and Security team at A Path for Europe, PFU. I am very delighted today to see so many of you participating today. And I'd like to first start with introducing A Path for Europe, as well as today's topic and the speaker to you. PFU was founded in 2020 as an independent non-profit think tank, and it focuses on the future of the European Union. Our team is exclusively composed of young researchers, and we conduct research, we develop policy advice, and we want to foster engagement for Europe through debates and talks like this one today. This web talk is part of our monthly event series called Coffee Conversations. I hope you have your coffee with you, in which we want to explore current topics within the different EU policy areas that our think tank covers. The structure of the event is as follows. After this introduction, I will ask Professor Ischinger to give a brief statement about his vision and thoughts on a European army, as well as the short and long-term issues around it. And after his intervention, I will ask a couple follow-up questions, but mostly I will leave it up to you. If you do have questions, please post them in the chat or post your name in the chat and you will be invited to ask questions at the very end. This is a really great opportunity to actively join the conversation, so I really encourage you. The topic of today's talk is long-term and short-term perspectives, a European army, which was inspired by Professor Ischinger's book, Welt in Gefahr, or World in Danger, more specifically the 8th chapter on Europe. The timing of today's topic was actually very apt, as we witnessed several significant world events unfold over the last weeks. First, there was the European disagreement with the United States over the withdrawal of troops in Afghanistan. Then came the State of the Union speech by the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, where she made unprecedented remarks on building a European defense union. And last, a new pact named AUKUS was announced, which involves Australia's purchase of nuclear-powered submarines from the UK and US, rather than the conventional ones from France, as they had previously agreed. As you may have heard, the French President Macron is kind of upset about this, and he recalled his ambassadors to Washington and Canberra, and the European Union demanded an apology. With each of these events, new voices have emerged from within parts of Europe demanding to see progress on creating a European army. And in this pursuit, perhaps Germany, with its large economic power, could nudge the EU in this direction. Today, we are very delighted to have this discussion with one of the most preeminent voices in German foreign policy, Professor Ischinger, who will illuminate some of the factors around the creation of such an army and how we may develop the EU security policy in this aspect. Professor Ischinger has been the chairman of the Munich Security Conference since 2008. He's a German career diplomat, and he was the German State Secretary, the Deputy Foreign Minister, from 1998 to 2001. From 2001 to 2006, he was also the Federal Republic of Germany's ambassador to the United States, and later to the United Kingdom too. He is a senior professor at the Hertie School in Berlin, and he serves on the boards of companies and a number of nonprofit institutions. So hello, Professor Ischinger. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hello, everybody. Hi, Poland. It is a real pleasure to, first of all, to see you again, because we met, of course, at the Hertie School, and to have this chat with this really impressive group. So welcome, everybody. As you just said, this is actually not a bad time to discuss questions of European Union capabilities, possible military roles, etc., because of the fact that over the last few weeks, the quote-unquote Afghanistan debacle has demonstrated, even to the general public, how militarily unable to act, how militarily weak we Europeans tend to be if the United States is not around to support and to help and to lead, etc. And second, as Poland has just pointed out, the events of the last few days, the French furor, if I can call it that, over the sabotaged submarine deal with Australia, of course, has raised yet another entire category of issues of transatlantic doubts about reliability, doubts about trustfulness, etc. So this is, against this backdrop, it is, I think, a good time, a good moment to discuss the question of quote unquote a European army. So let me look forward to discussing this with all of you. Let me just throw out a few general considerations about this. First of all, the idea of a European army, of an EU army, is of course not an entirely new idea. If you do a little bit of research, you will find that almost every serious German political party, for example, has had over the years the idea, the vision of a European army in their party platforms, in their programmatic papers, etc. We've had, point two, we've had over the last 8 years or so, even occasional meetings, summits of the European Union that were either partially or entirely devoted to questions of security and defense. In earlier decades, of course, these issues did not play a significant role in the management and in the vision of what the European Union should do or should not do. Throughout all of these discussions, there's always been one really quite serious concern. If we propose, we on the European side, if we propose the creation of military capabilities, even going as far as proposing the creation of a European army, is that not going to weaken the resolve and the degree of cohesion and the strength of the North Atlantic Alliance, of NATO? That particular debate is about as old as NATO is. And in the 1970s and 80s, even into the 90s, US administrations tended to try to discourage Europeans to think about building up their own military capabilities because of this concern that this might lead into a direction that would take away resources from NATO. So that is a concern that has existed throughout the history of these concerns. Now, here's my view. My view is, let's be realistic and let's ask, as we consider the desirability of such a vision, let's ask some very fundamental and simple questions. Let's assume we had a European army. Who would send, which president, which institution would send the soldiers, the military folks in this army to their death, into combat? Would that be the European Parliament? Would it be the European Council? Would it be the President of the European Commission? I hope not. Has anyone thought about that? What would be the chain of command if we had a European army? Now, if you ask these very, very simple questions, you find out almost immediately that even if we had serious, respectable military capabilities in the European Union, the political decision-making process that is required in order to make use of military resources does not exist. Not even the foundations of that exist. Let me be more specific. As we speak, the Europe, and as you all know, I'm sure, the European Union, as it exists today, is governed by what we call the Treaty of Lisbon, about a decade old. The Treaty of Lisbon provides for a decision-making process, which is in principle based on the idea of what we call qualified majority voting. Now, let's not go into the details, but what it means is the majority decides and the minority accepts the majority decision. This applies to most areas of competence of the European Union, in particular to trade, for example, etc., where indeed the European Union is an actor in international trade negotiations that is taken seriously, that is respected, because whoever represents the European Union, has 450 million citizens behind him and huge economic power. One of the few areas that is exempted from the qualified majority voting principle is foreign policy, security, and defense, where unanimity is required. So as we speak, if the European Union wishes to take a very simple foreign policy decision, let's say, for example, should we recognize Mr. Guaido in Venezuela, or should we recognize President Maduro? That is an issue that needs to be decided by consensus with a unanimity vote. In other words, even a secondary question such as this requires unanimity. Now imagine in the European Council or among the foreign or defense ministers, the question coming up, let's send a couple of brigades into, eastern Ukraine to fight the Russians alongside the Ukrainian army, because we've now decided that we wish to defend Ukraine against Russia. Would it work? Would a majority decision would that work? Well, maybe it would. But as we speak, a consensus would be required. And of course, there's an almost 100% certainty that 1, 2, 3, 4, or 6 or more countries will say no, because they'll say it's more important for us to be involved in Libya or in Mali or somewhere else than in Ukraine at this time. In other words, even the question of taking on a certain conflict area and considering the deployment of military force is something which is light years away from the current capacity, management capacity of the European Union. Leaving aside the question of the presence of such military capabilities. Now, and I promise to be brief, just a brief word about the military capabilities. If the 27 members of the European Union took the question of military capabilities seriously, they would, of course, need to think very hard about acquisition, about joint acquisition, about joint training, and joint deployment. The way the 27 member countries of the European Union operate today is the exact opposite of that. Small countries like, Denmark or Estonia or Greece or Portugal buy on the market in the United States 12, F-16 fighter aircraft for a huge amount of money, and they buy this nationally, separately. So there are 12 Austrian F-16s, and maybe there are 18 Danish F-35s, and they're all individually bought and arranged and equipped and trained. Just imagine what synergy effects and what savings could be obtained if the European Union had a program that said, if you want a new fighter aircraft, we'll have a central authority at Brussels that will buy for all of the EU member countries at, of course, a cut rate price, because we're going to buy 200 from Boeing or from Airbus or from whoever is the supplier for all of the member countries. And we'll train together, equip together, maintenance together, etc. None of that is happening today. We proclaim to advocate a European army, at least many of us do. And I'm the first to advocate the wonderful vision, but we are, I repeat myself, light years away at the level of practical day-to-day reality from putting flesh to that particular bone. So my recommendation is, let's start with realistic steps that would matter. I'm not in favor of abandoning the idea, the vision of a European army, but let's be realistic. Let's accept the fact that we have not even started to build the decision-making arrangements, nor the military capabilities that would make sense if you wanted to defend the interests and the borders and the people of 27 countries encompassing 450 million people. So just to conclude, my view would be, let's spend our energy, our creativeness on such issues as what we call pooling and sharing. How much money could be saved? How much more fighting power could we create if we went into joint acquisition, joint training, joint command centers? You understand what I'm saying? Doing everything jointly, maybe 3 nations, 5 nations, 7, doesn't always have to be all 27 together. There are some reasonably good initiatives within the European Union. Germany and France have started a couple. Germany, my own country, Germany and the Netherlands have started very interesting cooperation programs bilaterally. There's also one that we conduct with Poland. In other words, things have happened, but it's very small pilot style programs which do not, in the eyes of critical observers from the outside, really impress the world at large about European capacity to defend European interests. Very last remark, as a practicing diplomat, I started my diplomatic career in the mid-70s, so it's been a long time. As a practicing diplomat, I know what the major diplomatic weakness is. When diplomats don't have a better idea, they try to improve institutions. You create a committee or a coordinating body or so. And that would be my criticism, just a proposal for you to look at these arrangements. We have in the EU over the last couple of years, we have created PESCO, for example. Some of you will be familiar with the PESCO program. We proclaimed that we will create a defense fund, with 2-digit billion dollars or euros. Well, it ended up getting only half of that amount of money. But even that amount of money, even if it's only half, is of course not good enough to really make a major difference given the enormity of today's and tomorrow's military budgets. So instead of playing around with institutional arrangements, let's be serious and let's ask the specialists. And the specialists in this particular case are the generals, our own ones, American ones, Russian ones, Turkish ones, and let's ask them, how impressive do you think Europe is when it comes to deploying its military? And in 2021, as we speak, that capacity is, of course, extremely underdeveloped, as all of us have seen when we, when we accepted the bitter fact that even if we had wanted to, all 27 together, we could not have defended not even the airport in Kabul, because we didn't have the satellite reconnaissance, we didn't have the logistics, we didn't have the required medical evacuation teams, etc., etc., etc. So, in other words, my proposition is, let's pursue the vision of a European army, but let's do it in a realistic manner, step by step. And the very first important step, as Poland knows from our discussions at Hertie, is to change the modus operandi of foreign policy and defense decision-making in the EU, and going from unanimity to majority voting. If we can't even get that done, forget about a European army. Full stop.
Thank you very much for that. I have a few follow-up questions. And one of them is, how can the Germans be the initiators of this new step in further integration without being seen as trying to dictate central power? Is this maybe a slightly impossible task?
That's a good question, but I don't think so. I don't think it's an impossible task. If those of you who are interested to pursue these questions intellectually a little more, may I invite you to check our website, securityconference.org, and you can find on our website a report which we issued a year ago about the desired role for Germany in the European Union as we saw it, my team and I. And we called that report Germany the enabling power. In other words, arguing the idea of using German economic power is not to make Germany look like a powerful country. It's not to compete with UK or with France in their dream of remaining a world power, even as we are beginning to understand that all European countries are small countries in global terms. But the idea being that we should use German political, economic, and other elements of power as an enabling element to make the European Union a more credible, a more serious actor in international affairs. And Poland, just to underscore this point, look, most of us have now understood that going forward, one of the most important and probably most difficult challenges for the transatlantic community in the next decade or two is going to be how to deal with China. Should we do it more in the American way, pushing back forcefully, or should we prefer the European way, trying to maintain business relationships and trying to figure out a way to deal with China? I'm not going to take a position on this here, but what I do know is that if the European Union continues to speak with China and about China with 27 different voices, we should not be astonished if we're not being taken seriously in Washington or in Beijing, or for that matter, in Moscow. So it is very important, not just for the purpose of military credibility, but also for the purpose of simple diplomatic and political credibility, to come up with one voice of the EU on China, and with a clear EU strategy on Russia, and not with 27 different positions. And if you think about that for a moment, one has to admit that we are only at the beginning of a painful process of training ourselves, of training the French, training the Germans and everybody else to actually accept the idea that we, all of us, should try to enable the European Union, not seek national glory and national power. That's, 19th century, but to try to advance our interests in common with the interests of the 26 partners through an enhanced capacity of the European Union to act. And if we can do that over the next generation, maybe a European army can and will emerge. I would very much hope it will. Okay.
Well, I think a good question after this is, would this not fuel a new arms race?
No, I don't think it has. I don't think that is a foregone conclusion, because as we speak, if you add up on a balance sheet, if you add up the current numbers of soldiers and equipment and airplanes and ships, etc., of the European Union, you end up with a pretty impressive list, actually. Is also, if you look at total budget numbers, it's not nothing. The problem is that most of our countries are really small countries. And of course, if you have only 12 F-16s, you can't organize an expeditionary force, whether it's in Mali or in Afghanistan or Libya or elsewhere, because routinely, everybody knows that if you have 12 high-tech airplanes, at least 1/3, if not 1/4 of them is always in maintenance. So only maybe 6 or 8 or 9 are going to be capable of flying, etc. So it is almost an operational necessity in the era of high-tech equipment. It's not 18th century cannon that needs to be cleaned once a year. This is high-tech stuff. You could, if you take it seriously, you could really save a lot of money if you had joint maintenance, if you bought the same helicopter, everybody. I'm sure some of you are aware of this. We have, of course, built by a European company, by Airbus or one of the other European competitors, we have European helicopters, or we have European airplanes, the Tornado, the Eurofighter, etc. But believe me, each nation orders its own specific equipment for the dashboard, for the ejector seat, for all sorts of communication equipment, so that a British Tornado pilot, even if he's extremely well trained, could not possibly ever fly a German Tornado, or vice versa. That is, of course, very, very stupid nonsense. So we should give up these national, dreams of having the better Tornado because we have a better communications equipment than the British or the French. It's all nonsense. Let's do things together. We'll save money. Let's train together. That will teach our soldiers to speak one language and to understand each other. And let's create operational plans that allow the deployment of our nations, if there is a demand for that, whether it's a UN peace operation or whether it's a combat mission. where we would be able to deploy our troops in an efficient and capable manner together, even if we don't have, in the formal sense of the word, a European army as such. Creating capabilities and joining forces and training together and creating a sense of the same purpose. That's what matters at this point.
And who would you say are the major forces against a European army within Germany and within Europe?
Well, within Europe, for the last several decades, the one party that kept raising concerns about the very idea of EU military capabilities was, of course, the United Kingdom, because the United Kingdom adhered to the notion, whether one agrees with this or not, that European military capabilities were unnecessary because we had NATO, and therefore this would only distract from the focus on NATO. Now, of course, the United Kingdom has left the European Union. I am not aware of any serious political party or group in Germany that is against the idea of a European army and of consolidating capabilities in the sense that I just presented to you. The problem is that even regardless of whether you consider this a European project or a German national project or a German national necessity to have a meaningful army to defend our own country, our parliament, as many of you I'm sure are aware, has not been able to find agreement on increased military spending. We continue to discuss in the current situation, even after the recent war between Azerbaijan and Armenia, which has really been an interesting laboratory of modern equipment, military equipment. We don't seem to be able to come to a conclusion in the German parliament about whether or not the German military should or should not acquire armed drones, even after having seen that armed drones were the decisive piece of equipment that helped the Azeri forces dominate the Armenian forces. I mean, there are really some very easy conclusions. So we have a problem in the German political setup that is not directly connected to the European vision. We have a problem with the German willingness to support a more robust military budget. It's as simple as that.
Thank you very much. And now I will yield the floor to Q&A. And if you would like to ask your question, I see we have quite a few questions in the chat already. I'm going to start with Vladimir. Vladimir from Prague. Would you like to say your question?
Okay. Okay, thank you very much, Professor Ischinger, for the excellent talk. I just wondered whether you could elaborate a bit on the options or scenarios of German elections from the point of view of security policy, because we see that this is not a big issue in the election debate. It hasn't been. So it's actually the standard situation in Germany. And we've also seen that Angela Merkel was not really keen on these defense and military issues. So there happened something, but it was not really any kind of a breakthrough. So small steps forward, but not really breakthrough. My question is simply whether you see a chance for the new chancellor, be it the one or the other person, being more sort of dedicated to this issue of really building aktionsfähige Europa, so Europe able to really deliver on these issues, foreign policy, defense policy. Many thanks.
Well, thank you. That's a very good set of questions, Vladimir. Am I optimistic about our capability post-election to deal with these requirements better? Well, you know, I should let me put it this way. As a professionally trained diplomat, I have to always be an optimist, because you cannot be a successful diplomat if you don't believe that, you know, if it doesn't work now, maybe it works in a year or it works in 2 years. You need strategic patience, right? And you need some fundamental optimism. And I have the fundamental optimism, but I am not very optimistic at this point that we will discover next week after our elections this coming Sunday that the government coalition that will emerge from this election process will be more robust in terms of, you know, defense issues, etc. It is a pity, if you ask me, of course, that's really my personal view as a voter, as a citizen. It is a pity that in this election campaign, for reasons which I fail to understand, these existential questions of, you know, what kinds of threats is Europe going to be confronted with going forward? China, nuclear proliferation, Iran, Russia going, you know, amok, maybe doing more stuff like Crimea or Donbass. How would we react to that? The situation in the Black Sea, which is quite unhappy militarily, with being dominated more and more by the Russian Navy, and with lots of concern by our Romanian and Bulgarian and, of course, even Turkish NATO partner, etc. So is that something which is being discussed in this current election campaign in Germany? Unfortunately not. And I would even go a step further. I am sick and tired, really, speaking very personally, with our media. Because on German television, you have discussions with the, you know, with the major candidates practically every day, every couple of days. And the questions they get is mostly about, you know, the pension system, taxation, social issues, etc. The future of the European project, the future of our relationship with Russia, the future of NATO, of the EU, etc., is being ignored largely, with very rare exceptions. So I am at this point not exactly very optimistic that you will get a strong signal from Germany, from Berlin, after these elections. That would almost amount to a small miracle if we had a governing coalition in a couple of months or so that would demonstrate a resolve to make Germany militarily more capable, and thus make a major contribution to making the European Union, and of course NATO also, more capable. So I'm a little skeptical at this moment. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Johannes, would you like to go and ask your question?
Yes, good afternoon from Hamburg. I'm Johannes Park. I recently graduated in the MPP program from Hertie School. Thank you very much, Poland, for organizing this talk. It's very difficult to find discussions on foreign policy in these days, as Ambassador Ischinger mentioned. I have a question with regard to the European Army. Do you think, Ambassador Ischinger, it makes sense to, as we see it also in the discussion on stricter climate change or climate rules, to go or to opt for a coalition of the willing, meaning you mentioned Germany and Dutch cooperation, German-Dutch cooperation, German-French cooperation, wouldn't that push the door open into a coalition of the willing and let others who are critical or want to be out, I don't know which nation, but let them later in and go there to pursue this path? Thank you.
Great question. Thank you very much. The current German government, led by Angela Merkel, has pursued a philosophy that was essentially based on the idea of leaving no one behind. And I think that in principle, that's actually not a bad idea if you have 27 countries that are quite different economically and there is where they come from historically, etc. Remember, in the financial crisis, in the migration crisis and disagreements, Chancellor Merkel and her government tried to keep the EU together as best they could at the time. However, looking at the current setup in defense and foreign policy, I am moving personally more and more in the direction that you have just indicated, namely in the direction of maybe we need to start a closer association of some countries in the EU that are not only capable but politically willing to take to walk an extra mile, but we should of course make, and that is also demanded by the Lisbon Treaty, we should try to make sure that whatever steps we might undertake as a small, beginning coalition of the willing, we should make sure that everybody understands that the door is open to the others. Just like in when we created the euro, the currency, it was made clear that other countries, if they meet the requirements, are going to be free to join. So it's not an exclusive, club. I believe that it would really take us a long way in the right direction if, after the creation of the next German coalition, and after, let's assume that Emmanuel Macron gets himself re-elected next spring in Paris, I think it would take us a long way if at that moment, by the middle of next year, with some renewed French energy also, France and Germany could start an initiative inviting those who are interested and willing to move forward. Now there is one issue, and I'm looking at Vladimir on my screen here. Of course, most of our Central European partners are quite skeptical about Macron's pronouncements about strategic autonomy of the European Union, because Poland and the Baltic states and other Central European EU members feel so threatened by possible Russian operations that they believe they need credible and concrete reassurance and support by the United States. And they are, for good reasons, aware of our weakness and our inability, militarily speaking, of doing anything serious if ever there was a confrontation of sorts. So the trick would be to make sure that this coalition of the willing is not an anti-NATO coalition of the willing. And we would need to make sure that the United States, that Joe Biden in the current setup would say, this is a great idea and I support it. And I will put my NATO resources at the disposal of this European effort, which in the long run is going to make Europe stronger, and through a stronger Europe, NATO as a whole will be stronger. Last remark on this, just to give you some additional food for thought, we have now, for 40 years in NATO, been debating the question of burden sharing. The question has always been, these Europeans, can they please, in the Cold War it was 3%, can they please spend 3% of their gross national product on defense? Now in the post-Cold War situation, we're a little more modest. We demand, or we agreed to demand 2%. Most of us, including Germany, is not even fulfilling that self-proclaimed promise. So we're really not doing very well in terms of pure military capabilities. And that is the first thing that that would need to change. If we want to impress anyone in Russia or even in Washington, this creation of a new committee is not going to do the trick. We would need to come up with a willingness to commit more resources, or to do more pooling and sharing, as I tried to propose in the beginning of our discussion. But essentially, I am more personally, I'm more and more among those who believe that at the end of the day, we will probably have to adopt the coalition of the willing approach, leaving it to the rest of the European Union to join as they see fit later on. Otherwise, we will not get anywhere in a serious way in the foreseeable future.
Thank you very much, Professor Ischinger. We have a few more questions, but I'm not sure if you have any time for one more, or if you have to leave.
I have a couple of minutes to go, but then I will need to rush away.
Okay.
I have another commitment, but
fantastic.
Maybe
so,
one more question.
One last question, Dylan. Would you like to quickly ask a final question?
Yeah, sure. I posted it in the chat if you need to read it over as well. So thank you for your comments, Ambassador. I share your view, of course, that we need to take realistic steps forward, as you said. There was a proposal last week in a commentary coming out of a Brussels think tank, putting forth the idea of a 50 to 60,000 force in line with the Helsinki headline goals, composed of national brigades rather than mixed brigades. But I feel like that is still too ambitious. There's also Borrell's recent proposal of an initial entry force. But there is no news so far about how to make that viable and how to fix the previous issues with the EU battle groups. But you also, in your solutions, put forward some solutions that already exist. I mean, you speak about joint training. That already exists with the EU battle groups. You speak about joint command centers, which already exist and multiply at the EU level. And you speak about joint acquisitions, which also brings up very legitimate questions about duplication. So my question is basically, how can we facilitate interoperability and create a joint strategic culture in order to actually use these structures that we already have at our disposal? And I recently, last week, published a commentary about this for the Center for European Policy Studies here in Brussels, putting forth 3 ideas. 1, to increase the amount of participating member states per EU battle group. 2, prolong their standby period. And 3, bring pre-existing cooperation, such as the one that you referred to, Franco-German cooperation, but also Benelux defense cooperation, into the EU framework via PESCO by providing an added European defense fund bonus to those capabilities that are jointly developed and subsequently jointly operated. So the current bonus is only for joint development. It's a 10% bonus. that I put forth, the idea of adding another bonus for joint operation. And so I was wondering if this could maybe be the key to really encouraging member states to use these EU structures that they already have at their disposal.
Great, thank you very much. I appreciate this very much. I see that you've done a lot of work on these issues. Well, I'm sure all of the ideas which you just put forth are meaningful, at least to some extent. The problem is that all of these ideas, I mean, you know, in 1999, I was part of the negotiating team at the time. We agreed to develop rapid response teams by 2003. Nothing ever happened. In 2007, we proposed and declared to create these so-called battle groups. Has any of them ever been deployed? Of course not. And only 3 months ago, on May the 5th of this year, 14 EU countries proposed a rapid military response force of about approximately, if I remember correctly, about 5,000 soldiers. I'm not sure that that proposal will get off the ground anytime soon. So the forces of slowing things down have been very strong. And once again, let me remind you that all of these arrangements and existing capabilities, and even more capabilities going forward, will require a decision-making system that is less cumbersome than the current, unanimity rule. One of my worst professional experiences was in the 1990s when I was senior political director of the German Foreign Ministry, and we had to watch the killing, literally, of tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of people in Bosnia-Herzegovina, because the force that was there with French and British and other forces on the ground, a UN force, had what we called at the time a dual key system. The commander on the ground was unable to make a single strategic decision, deployment decision, without the other key, which was in New York, being turned at the same time. The result was that no decision was ever taken and nothing happened. And the whole operation, UNPROFOR at the time, was a tragic failure. We were and we are responsible, we Europeans, for the unnecessary death of many, many thousands of people, because we were unable to get our act together in terms of political decision-making. The capabilities, the airplanes would have been available, certainly even more so if the United States had decided to participate earlier. So my personal professional lesson is, let's first agree on how we will decide to deploy these types of forces, if we have them. And if there is not a reliable process, then we should admit that unfortunately they're not going to be deployed like our battle groups, because there's always going to be somebody among the 27 who will say, well, we have elections next week and my prime minister is sick at the moment and I can't get a hold of him and I will have to veto this particular decision this afternoon. That's the reality of European Union decision-making at the time. So I hope that ideas such as yours will fly, but it's going to take a lot more energy. And let me conclude, because I have to go. Let me conclude on an optimistic note. I had a long discussion yesterday with senior folks in the EU Commission. And over the last number of days, because of Afghanistan and because of the French submarine deal, of course, many of the European Union prime ministers, chancellors, foreign ministers, defense ministers have been eagerly chatting with each other about what to do. As I'm sure most of you know, France will take over the presidency of the EU on the 1st of January for the next 6 months. And I would be willing to bet with you an entire case of champagne that France, unless something dreadful happens, that France will devote a lot of its energy for these 6 months that they sit in the chair to push the European Union forward on these issues that we're discussing here today. So that is an opportunity. I have heard over the last many years too many wake-up calls, so-called quote-unquote wake-up calls, which rarely led to anything than a second wake-up call, but there was never any real action. So let me just simply express my hope that because of the serious events that we've just witnessed in Afghanistan and in the Indo-Pacific issue, that maybe France, if other member countries are going to help France push this forward, that we could finally maybe really make a difference in the issue of European defense, European capacity to act in the direction of, at the end of the day, creating something that deserves to be called a European army. So it's a tough challenge with lots of forces in many of our countries that are not friendly, that would like to pursue a more pacifist, forces that don't like military engagements of any sort. So it's an uphill battle, but it's worth pursuing it. I would encourage all of you and your organization, to promote this further, this good idea of making Europe more capable to defend its interests and to make sure that it cannot be the victim of extortion, because that's the essence of security. Creating a ring around yourself that insulates you from people who would like to impose on you their will, their political or maybe even their military will. And deterring that through the ability of taking decisions and of deploying defensive instruments, military instruments, if necessary. That's what it's all about. So continue. I would simply encourage you, continue to raise these issues, to debate them, challenge people when they, come up with easy solutions to such issues as a European army. It's going to be a tough battle, but it's a battle worth pursuing in the interests of the European project, which I truly believe in. In that sense, I'm just a normal German, because I think, fortunately, in my country, there's still a large majority that is essentially pro-Europe, and that can be brought along if it's properly explained to them. Poland, I need to run. I'm already behind schedule.
Thank you so much for your time, Professor Ischinger. It was lovely to see you again.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you very much for your interest and for your very interesting questions. All the best, Poland. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Take care.
Thank you. If everyone can wait a few more seconds, I will explain a few things. First of all, you will be able to find the recording of this conversation on our website and on YouTube and on our YouTube channel. And also, please do join our newsletter so that you can find out more about such events in the future. We have also saved a few of the questions, well, all of the questions that we could not get to today. We will try to get them to Professor Ischinger's office. But if you have anything else to say, please do send them to us. Thank you so much for your time.